Hi, I'm Bob Evans. I am the Chief Scientist of the SS Central America Project, and I'm very happy to be here at the World's Fair of Money, the American Numismatic Association's annual convention, held this year in Rosemont in Chicagoland. California Gold Marketing Group, for whom I am the Curator and Chief Scientist, has brought the bell of the SS Central America for display and an educational exhibit here at the World's Fair of Money. The bell of the SS Central America is one of the most spectacular artifacts I think that we've recovered from the shipwreck of the steamship. It was made in 1853 at the Morgan Iron Works in New York City. It is made of bronze and weighs 268 pounds. It has a very lovely tone, which you're going to be hearing here a little bit later on this bit. We've also brought along a model of the SS Central America, a wonderful 55-inch long, 3/16 to a foot, 3/16 inch to 1 foot model replica of what this steamship looked like. You can see that it was a side-wheel steamship with paddles at the side, which would be how they would get their propulsion. It does have masts and sails, although those masts and sails were mostly used in order to right the vessel and make sure that the paddle wheels were turning evenly in the water on both sides. This was an early steamship technology, the idea of having paddle wheels. A few years later, they had actually conducted experiments. The English Navy actually conducted a tug of war between a paddle wheel steamship and a screw steamer of about equal tonnage. And in both instances, because they did it in both directions, they determined that the screw steamer was the far more efficient engine. It could outpull the paddle wheel steamer. But these were the very early days of steam navigation on the open ocean. This technology had not been tested in the worst of storms. It sounds very familiar to us now, and we see examples of it in Titanic. We see examples, for that matter, in the internet. How certain things get out of control, and you cannot control them with human ingenuity. Human ingenuity and engineering often creates a sense of superiority, and the sense that we can overcome this problem with our power. This was the age of steam power, and steam power was the big, most worshipped technologies of the day. The other being the telegraph, which also figures into our story. The steamship was 280 feet long, essentially the length of a football field, so a very large vessel. And there were 478 people on board. About 100 members of the crew, and then 470 some passengers. Some of the passengers were actually working their passage, because passage was very expensive. We'll get into that in a bit. But so the line between crew and passenger somewhat blurs there. But we know of 478 names of people who were on board this ship when it sank off of the Carolina coast on September 12th, 1857. But people who come to the exhibit here, they can look at all of the different details of what such an interesting vessel looked like. There's even one tiny little figure that looks somewhat like Captain Herndon standing on the deck there, which is, I'm not sure what I feel about that detail, but it's just fine. The question would be, why would he be up there alone? Anyway, a very interesting nautical architecture and technology. Paddle wheel steamships plied the oceans for about 20 or 30 years until they were supplanted by screw steamers. It is hard for us today to conceive of a time when communication between California and New York Two-way communication took a matter of a couple of months. And yet this was a united state. California became a state in 1850, and one of the most important things was maintaining the mail service, because the telegraph wasn't across the country. Traveling by horse or wagon or things like that could take months. And this was the fastest means of communication. Because of that, the United States mandated that naval captains should be appointed to these merchant vessels in order to make sure that the mail got through, as well as twice monthly shipments of treasure, commercial shipment of gold, which averaged around $1 million. During the year, sometimes it went a little over $1 million. I've seen figures as high as $2 million. This is when gold was $20.67 to the ounce. So literally tons of gold would pass twice a month along the Panama route. They didn't fully understand hurricanes at that time. They called them West Indian cyclones. They sometimes referred to them as equinoctial storms because they knew that they occurred somewhere around the autumn equinox. September was hurricane season. A hurricane at that time was a nautical term, which simply meant that no sail could stand in such a wind. As it turns out, that's right about where we're talking about. Around 70 miles per hour is when you can't put up any kind of sail. Your strongest little triangular sail just hoisted on the mast will blow to shreds in such a thing. And that's what a hurricane meant back then. Nowadays, we name our hurricanes. They didn't name the hurricanes at that time. This was simply called the Great Storm of 1857. And it did a lot of damage to shipping up and down the coast, the SS Central America being the most prominent ship that was caught in it. And so these panels in our exhibit here, they describe the storm and the rescue of the women and children specifically. A small sailing vessel came into sight on the day that the SS Central America sank. It sank in the evening around noon. A small sailing vessel, the Brig Marine out of Boston, came within sight. And Captain Herndon, Captain William Lewis Herndon, who held the rank of commander in the United States Navy, he ordered the women and children to be lowered into the boats and evacuated to the Brig Marine. This was an amazing story. For anyone who's ever had to go from the big boat to the little boat, as I have, I can tell you this is the most terrifying thing I've ever done at sea, because they don't move in the same rate. It wasn't a simple lowering. Some of the women reported that they'd been dropped into the boat. Well, they weren't dropped into the boat. They were dangled over the side, and then the boat came up under them and went wham. And so it must have seemed that they were dropped into the boat, but that wasn't the case. The Brig Marine rescued in total 100 people, all of the women and children, plus a few dozen of the men, both those who had rowed, and after the women and children were evacuated, some of the men made it into the final lifeboat passages. There were only 3 lifeboats of the 6 that were on board that were still in working, functioning condition, and after that evacuation, they were cast off. The SS Central America sank about 8 o'clock in the evening, and roughly 6 hours later, in the middle of the night, a Norwegian bark, a 3-masted sailing vessel, sailed into a midst of floating humanity. The captain said that he heard cries from the night and discovered that he was in among men who had been shipwrecked. And he and his crew managed to rescue another 50 men from the water later, that evening and that nighttime, and into the early hours of the morning of the daylight. Whereupon they weren't seeing anybody else, they couldn't find anybody else, so they broke off their search. Incredibly, 3 men survived for another 8 days and 20 hours in one of the lifeboats that had been cast off, and they were picked up by a vessel that was on its way to England, 300 miles north of where the Central America sank, having been carried there by the Gulf Stream for over 8 days. So we knew that where the Central America sank, it sank somewhere in the Gulf Stream. The problem being that the Gulf Stream meanders at that latitude. Between Cape Hatteras and Florida, it moves in and out like a hose under extreme pressure. It's really kind of interesting that way. The survivors are important to us because the survivors and witnesses really provided the raw data that we used to develop a search plan. There was enough nautical information among that, enough nautical coordinates taken by the captains, the celestial coordinates determined by sextant, that we could somewhat pinpoint the area of the ocean in which we were going to search, although we ended up searching about 1,000 square miles using side scanning sonar in 1986. In 1988, we confirmed the site. We put our cameras down and we found various things, including the bell. The bell helped to confirm that we had found the right site. I will explain that here in a little bit. The SS Central America has yielded over 11,000 pieces of gold that have found their way into the numismatic market. And these are coins and bars that have a real story behind them. So people find them very attractive because of that connection to that story. I've got a photograph here of a scene from the bottom as the treasure was found. We called this area the Garden of Gold. It was the part where the commercial shipment was. The SS Central America on its final voyage was carrying $1.219 million when gold was $20.67 to the ounce. So this was over 2 tons in the commercial shipment. It probably was carrying about an equal amount in the hands of the passengers. There were 470 some passengers who were on board, and passage on the SS Central America and its sister ship on the Pacific part of the voyage, it wasn't cheap. It cost $300 to travel in first class, $250 in second class, and $150 to travel in steerage, which was simply a bunk bed with a curtain for privacy. That's 7.5 ounces of gold. The big inducement here being that you could make this trip in between 3 and 4 weeks instead of it taking months to get across the country by other means. Captain Herndon, for his role in maintaining order on the SS Central America and managing the evacuation of the women and children and the survivors, Captain Herndon is hailed as a naval hero. He did hold the rank of commander in the United States Navy at the time. He had done a fabulous exploration of the valley of the Amazon River a few years before that, in 1851 and 1852, and had published a very popular work on that. Congress published it. And he was the first one of European extraction to know what was what in the Amazon basin. It took them months to go across that. Mark Twain commented that he had read this book when he was young, and it inspired him to take up a life of travels. But Captain Herndon, in the year that followed the sinking of the SS Central America, they erected a granite obelisk, a monument to him at Annapolis, where at the United States Naval Academy, where that heroism and that honor in maintaining order and managing to rescue so many people from their fate in the open ocean. Anyway, it is memorialized there. So this is the bell of the SS Central America. It is essentially as found. It spent about 30 years in a tank of distilled water, which we changed the water a few times in order to fully desalinate it. But as you can see, it is this wonderful chunk of bronze. It weighs 268 pounds. And we've brought it here so that people can get a connection with the history that is different than the connection that coins give you. This bell was the voice of the ship. I like to think of it that way anyway. And the voice of the shipwreck now that it's recovered. It connects you with an actual sound that the people back in 1857 would have heard. So we get to hear what they heard. And there's something very special in that aural sensation that you get from listening to this and just imagining what it must have been like on those ships. So I'm going to toll this bell 8 times for 8 o'clock, because it was about 8 o'clock in the evening that the SS Central America sank. So that was the voice of the SS Central America speaking to you over the century and a half or more since it sank on September 12th, 1857.